Hi everyone. I hope you're having a good weekend or a good break or wherever you might be post-class. For those of you who weren't able to attend class, I know that some of you were traveling and getting an early start. I wanted to take a few moments and offer a recap of the class. If you were in class, you might find this helpful. I'll try to front end it with things that would be more pertinent to you. And if you weren't in the class, you'll find this, I think, to be very important in terms of preparing for when we meet again. I'll talk a little bit about your outlines. I'll talk a little bit about the readings that we've done thus far. I'll talk a little bit about maybe the ways you might begin to orient towards your paper topics and writing your papers. So a couple things. First of all, as it relates to your outline, you are really left to your own devices. Some of you have already turned in a draft outline. I provided feedback. You're working on revising the outlines. Some of you have talked to me about ideas you've had about changing your paper topics. That's always a good thing to do, always something I'll be supportive of. And between now and the Wednesday after we get back, whenever you want to, you'll put together a draft outline. You've got an example. I encourage you to follow the example and then tweak around it. And I'll provide you with feedback based on that. A lot of the feedback will be providing you with an audio recording of my thoughts, or maybe I'll type something up. Always interested in talking with you over Zoom. We can schedule a Zoom call or we can schedule a meeting. So know that that's always available to you as we move forward. With regards to practice, this week we will be moving into a practice called Just As Mind. This is what you'll learn in Chapter 5. And I think I'll look forward to us talking about the Just As Mind practice as the mindfulness practice in the Chapter 5, where the topic is mindfulness. And I hope you'll find that it begins to really sort of breathe life into the connection between the mindfulness practices and what it is to be mindfully aware. In some ways, it's not really a new practice at all, and it draws upon and you build on the cumulative influence of the practices you've been doing. We, in class, went through and sort of began to lay out how long you might practice for each day for the next week or 2 weeks. I encourage you to take a few moments and to continue that process. And if you weren't in class, to actually lay out the duration of practice and the perhaps the type of practice that you would do each day over the course of the break and then beyond, because having written it down can be helpful to you. And then, as we discussed in class, that's just a starting point. Then you will navigate and make it shorter or longer or whatever it is as you actually sit down to practice. But it can be very helpful for setting us up to practice. Also, we listened to that wonderful podcast with She's a Shaheed, and I encourage you to listen to more of it, and I encourage you to listen to other podcasts, especially using the 10% Happier as a starting point, because they're all really like today's podcast, providing helpful information from people's perspectives, and in many cases people for whom we may hold them out as role models or find them to be very interesting personalities and can learn a lot. Hopefully it reinforces what you've already been learning, and you're able to actually allow it to both inform moving forward, reinforce what you've already learned, and or inspire you, or to have you be inspired by yourself. With regards to the spiral, if you weren't in class, I'll put up a link so that you can watch a demonstration of the spiral. It's a rather important demonstration. For those of you who were in class, it was very nice to do that together. I hope you found it informative. There were layers of insight that flow from that. You might want to watch the video. I'll find some video of me doing the spiral probably years ago or something. So if you watch it, you can be watching something that's a little different than what you experienced. Look for those insights. Remind yourself of those insights. That's one of the most important things. Insights like, where is it easiest to notice that you're in the spiral, and yet where is it easier to put it out, for example? Why do we sort of, when we practice, do we sort of construe ourselves as sitting at the point in the spiral, which is after the thoughts, feelings, and sensations and before the overreaction. Things like that, things we talked about. The idea that there's this match just waiting to be struck. And what is it that strikes that match and gets the spiral going? The ways in which the spiral is another way of looking at the snow globe. Getting off the spiral, and what is it that allows us to move off the spiral? Things like that. Importantly, one of your assignments, and really I could have put in 5 of these pages, so I encourage you to do this more than once, but we drew the spiral. You have at the back of the book an example of a spiral, and you'll be reading about the spiral in chapter 5 at least one time over the course of the time between now and when we see each other again. You will document, if you will, a spiral, your own spiral experience, hopefully close in time, very close in time to the spiral happening. And as you'll see on the webpage, you'll text me a picture of that spiral before our next class. I want to touch now a little bit on the readings that we've done, and as it relates to your paper, should your mind be orienting towards your paper. And I will put up on the website examples of prior papers so that you can see what other students have done who did fairly well, and perhaps that can be helpful to you to model something or to give you ideas. Chapter 1, we began with this idea that we've got this journey exploring mindfulness together. Chapter 1 was leadership, in particular self-leadership, and the reminder there was, if we're going to be practicing mindfulness and learning and developing a practice and applying it to our life within the law and outside the law, the first thing is perhaps self-leadership, if nothing else, to be doing the practices. But very importantly, as we learned from today's podcast interview with an extraordinary person, as we become more knowledgeable, as we understand the focused attention practice and the body scan practice and the open monitoring practice and soon the connection practice, as we understand ways of finding sort of calm through various settling techniques and the ways that they interrelate to and weave into and out of the mindfulness practices, we're able to begin to make modifications ourselves, to realize that we're freed from some rigid application, and on the one hand, not to dilute it so much that nothing's really happening, and at the same time, not to build in so many moving parts that it becomes unwieldy. And this is really, I think, the time in the semester where you will begin to, and can begin to, if you haven't already, really see that freedom, but also the responsibility to be able to find an accessible way of drawing on these practices. As we did in class, to even lower or close your eyes or have eyes wide open, and for 1 minute to focus on an object like the breath, or, as was brought into the class conversation, a sound. And when the mind wanders, bring it back, to just see it, to recognize the simplicity and the beauty of that, the accessibility of that, and to be building on top of that. And of course, we've been building on it for many, many weeks now, but not to forget the essential essence, that's an interesting phrase, of the focused attention practice, or of the body scan practice, or of the open monitoring practice. Each have their sort of fundamental pieces that are a little different, at least the way it seems, from the others, and yet in many ways they also support each other and come together in many ways. As we talked about in class, some of you, we didn't really get into the open monitoring practice discussion this week. We'll do that when we get back. But in many ways, it was challenging to sort of just hold this more sort of open, receptive, witnessing state. And that's in some ways because as our attention got pulled away, off we went. And so, 2 things. 1, this is why we are interested in practicing a focused attention practice on a regular basis, and even ongoing when you intermix it with the open monitoring, to really develop that capacity to be a little steadier, and to, when we notice mind wandering, return attention to the object, if it's a focused attention practice, or in the open monitoring practice, when we notice our mind beginning to wander, in that noticing, perhaps not to come back to something, because there's nothing to come back to, we're just witnessing, but perhaps to notice how that thought is perhaps already gone in the moment that we realize that we were having the thought. And then maybe there's another thought that follows, or a feeling, or we just sort of relax into the open spaciousness of being present for our experience. And you'll see how the chapter 5 practice, just as mind, is a slight, builds a little bit on the open monitoring practice and then steps away from really the idea of there being any practice. So we began with leadership and the idea of how it is that this begins with our journey begins with self-leadership. Also, how very significant and effective leaders draw upon practicing mindfulness to aid them in their their leadership endeavors. And then as you lead yourself across the semester, to be noticing the practices, the ones that resonate, variations on the theme, to be creative around that, as we not only lead ourselves to take our seat in practice, but we lead ourselves forward as we learn from the various practices. And I think that today's Shiza, I think, spoke to that very directly in terms of her own journey through meditative practices. Then we moved into attention, and so you have read about, and you have been probably among most significant among all the sort of essential pieces to what it is to be mindfully aware. You're perhaps most familiar now with attention, and importantly, that it's there, that you can begin to notice the way we talked about today when we talked about multitasking, it being pulled in different directions. And then that creates the opportunity to maybe manage our attention a little bit more skillfully, and how it is that we can notice mind wandering. And this becomes something that I'll just share with you, it's just the tip of the iceberg, which is huge. Not the least of which is that it's perfectly normal for the mind to wander, and it's not necessarily a problem at all. In fact, it opens the door to then deepen very important skills and capacities. So it's just the tip of the iceberg, and that's attention. Then we moved into relaxation, where we learned some relaxation practices, and very importantly, how it is that relaxation is a little different than what mindfulness is all about, but they overlap a lot, and how wonderful it is to have mindfulness practices that we do to sort of create the long game of steadiness and seeing things more clearly, being less likely to be pulled into spirals, more likely to be aware when spirals get going so that we can skate off of those spirals, and also to have the settling techniques that we can use and to really recognize that they work together really, really, really well. The assignment or the chapter that you have this week on self-care, in addition to the chapter on mindfulness, will further develop our understanding of the settling techniques, and in particular the settling technique of nurturing. And so that was relaxation. Then we moved on to awareness, and this is of course what we explored last week, and it's really just the beginning of our conversation. I think the most important takeaways are that we want to recognize when we are writing about mindfulness in our papers, etc., that there is a difference, sometimes very subtle, sometimes very significant, between awareness and attention, and how the two are oftentimes, as many of you noted in your papers, we use them interchangeably. And yet we can get away with that because no one's thinking about this interior space often that with such piercing need for precision that we can't say, oh, I'm aware of my breath, or I'm paying attention to my breath. And those are very different things. And yet at the same time, they have a lot of common ground. So we will continue our discussion of awareness. I think one of the most important things that came out of today's class was that if you're trying to be more aware, or you're trying to somehow control awareness, that's not really the way it works, certainly not the way we're exploring it. We are aware. The light bulb is bright. And then the more, just like the day with the sun is a bright day, but if clouds come in, it gets darker. But the sun is still there, and the openness of the sky is still there, just like our awareness is here. We are aware, but thoughts and feelings, especially when they become agitating, excited, or agitated, the way we oftentimes think about it, unpleasant, heavy, etc., it can obscure the their fully present sun and the light of the illumination that it offers us. And really, we're learning these various practices too, and I think this was a very important insight raised very early on in class, so that those moments of clarity and being present and less encumbered by thoughts and feelings arise more spontaneously and more often, and perhaps last a little longer because of the practicing that we're doing. And then, of course, in those moments, there's things that we can do to help, enrich the experience if we find ourselves being, pulled away or caught by thoughts or things that seem to be interfering. And that's, of course, where the settling techniques might come in. And so this is awareness. And now we're moving into mindfulness. I think you'll find it to be a very enjoyable and meaningful chapter to read, and along with jumping ahead a couple chapters to self-care. Okay, now with that, I'd like to close with just a little bit about your paper topics. One of you is very interested in working on your paper over the break. I imagine most of you are not, and you need not. But as you begin to move in the direction of your paper, the question was asked, well, if I want to get to my paper sooner than later, what should I be reading? What readings are there coming along? And my response was, and so this is what I'll share with you all, as you begin to pick a topic that really becomes its own interesting subject, it will be the research that you do out there, both in the mindfulness and law, and the mindfulness as it relates to that topic. Maybe it's anger, for example, and it relates to the law, and it also is written about outside of the law, that you will begin to really become more familiar and equipped to understand the fullness of what's already been written out there, and the ways that really wonderful writers, and that's part of your task, to be able to distinguish the things that are not saying so much from the things that are really speaking to that subject matter wisely and astutely, so that you can then begin to really be thinking about how you're going to develop your paper and apply it to a couple of specific instances. And so in regards to the last thing that I just said about you being the discerning agent of what's a useful paper and what's not, as opposed to just doing a whole bunch of research to get a bunch of material so that you can then highlight things and just sort of get them into the paper, is what we've been exploring with the fundamentals of leadership and attention and relaxation and awareness and now mindfulness, and what we have also begun to explore with negotiation and we'll be getting into with listening, for example, and judgment, are understanding the fundamentals of mindfulness practices and their application in the real world environments that we will continue to navigate and long have navigated, and to perhaps navigate it with a greater sense of ease and also perhaps more effectively. So this is what we've been exploring. And so when you start to look for outside readings, you can begin to note for yourself, this is helpful, well written, when they say awareness, or when they speak to attention, or when they are focusing on stress reduction. It makes sense given the way we're exploring it and the way that you're making sense of it. Or it's light and it's not particularly well thought out and it's very basic, and there's a lot out there that falls into this less helpful category. And then the things that you read and you say, yes, this makes sense. Oh, I see where the writer's coming from. They get this. They have a deeper understanding too. And they're offering something very useful in terms of the subject matter that you're exploring. So the leading yourself continues. And in this case, it continues as you will be reviewing and looking for reading materials to be source materials for your paper and to further inform your understanding of the subject matter. And to be able to pick and choose wisely. All right, I hope you have a wonderful break. I hope you have a good week following the break. I'll have on the website more specifics regarding a writing assignment with regards to the readings for this week or for next week, and also the practice, so you have greater clarity around the practice, and also, and lastly, getting out in nature. We talked in class about how many of you are going to Iceland and Bimini and exciting places and interesting places, or Colorado, or staying put and maybe getting to the ocean or your own backyard, and how it is that you can bring the focus attention practice and your crayons and that booklet to that domain. And also perhaps, and also I'll send a video of the So Be Mindful movement. We didn't get outside. It may well be that we begin our next class outside, and I'll send information about that before our next class. But in particular, maybe where you find yourself over the course of the next week, you might want to send me a picture of some beautiful aspect or interesting aspect of where you are, and I would like it if you did that, because I would like to assemble those and share those with our class. Wishing you well, all the best.